What would make an experienced ICU nurse walk away from the hospital just 1 week after her very first shift? There is a room at Columbia General Hospital that no one wants to enter. A room where patients report seeing shadows move on their own, where medical equipment operates without being connected, and where the temperature plummets 15 degrees in just 2 minutes. What happened inside room 313 on the night of March 15th completely changed my view of life and death. And what we found sealed within that wall for more than a century will make you question everything you believe about justice. But before I share this story that has haunted me for the last 8 months, hit subscribe to follow more stories like this, leave a like, and comment below where you're watching from. Now take a deep breath, because what you're about to hear will keep you awake tonight. My name is Emily Carter, and I'm a registered nurse with 6 years of ICU experience. Until that night in March, I had always prided myself on my rational approach to medicine, on my ability to stay calm under pressure. I had witnessed death many times, held the hands of people in their final moments, watched countless souls slip away from this world. I thought I understood the boundary between life and death, between the natural and the unexplainable. The events I'm about to describe happened during my very first night shift in the ICU at Columbia General Hospital, a 150-year-old institution in the heart of District of Columbia. I had just transferred from the cardiac unit at the Regional Medical Center, looking for new challenges. What I didn't know was that Columbia General carried a reputation for something entirely different. The hospital was an imposing Victorian structure, built in 1873, with tall windows that seemed to watch the city like ancient eyes. The ICU was housed in the oldest part of the building, on the 4th floor of the original wing. I should have paid more attention to the silence, because 3 weeks later, I would learn that silence was guarding a secret more than a century old. A secret that had already claimed the lives of at least 30 innocent people. My first shift was scheduled for March 15th, a Tuesday that began like any other. I arrived at 6:45 p.m. for the 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. rotation. The day nurse, Susan Torres, was a 50-year-old woman who had worked at Columbia General for more than 2 decades. She seemed competent and professional, but I noticed something about her demeanor, a nervous energy, as if she couldn't wait to leave. "You'll be working with Dr. Richard Morgan tonight," she said as we walked through the unit. "He's been here almost as long as I have. A good doctor, very thorough, but he has his own particular ways of doing things." It was when we reached room 313 that I noticed her voice change, more formal, more distant. "Room 313 is empty at the moment," she said, not looking at the closed door. "It's been empty for 3 weeks. Dr. Richard prefers to keep it that way unless we're at full capacity." "Why?" I asked. Susan paused. "There have been complications with that room. Mostly equipment malfunctions. But I would soon discover that faulty equipment was the least of room 313's problems." Dr. Richard approached the nurse's station at 7:30 p.m., carrying a stack of patient charts. He was a tall, lean man in his early 60s, with gray hair and piercing blue eyes. "Emily, right? Susan told me you have excellent credentials." "Thank you, Dr. Richard. I'm looking forward to working here." He nodded. Then his expression turned serious. "There are particular aspects of working here you should be aware of. Room 313. Susan may have mentioned it's currently empty. I prefer to keep it that way unless absolutely necessary. If we do need to use it, I expect you to follow very specific protocols." He handed me a laminated card with unusual procedures. Every piece of equipment in the room was to be checked every 2 hours, even if the room was empty. Any alarm from room 313 had to be investigated by 2 staff members, never alone. If a patient was admitted there, vital signs were to be recorded every 15 minutes. And strangest of all, a digital recorder had to be placed in the room and reviewed every morning for unusual sounds. "Dr. Richard, these protocols seem very specific. Has there been some particular problem with that room?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Emily, in 35 years of practicing medicine, I've learned there are aspects of this profession that can't be explained by textbooks. This hospital is old. It carries a long history, and sometimes that history bleeds into the present." Before I could ask what he meant, an alarm rang from room 403, and that's when my real education about Columbia General Hospital began. As the night deepened, I started noticing things that felt slightly off. Remember when I said I should have paid more attention to the silence? Well, there was more than silence. First, the temperature. Despite the hospital's modern climate control, the ICU had cold spots, particularly in front of room 313. Every time I passed that door, I felt a distinct chill. Second, the behavior of the other staff. David Rodriguez did his rounds with meticulous care, but he always paused before entering any patient room, as if listening for something. Third, and most significant, Dr. Richard's routine. Every hour, he walked the entire unit, but his route always ended at room 313, where he would stand outside the closed door for exactly 60 seconds before returning to the nurses' station. At 11:47 p.m., I decided to ask Olivia about my observations. I found her in the break room, sitting alone with a cup of tea. "Olivia, I hope you don't mind me asking, but I've noticed some unusual routines tonight. Is there something I should know about this unit?" She looked at me for a long moment. "You're very observant. Most new nurses don't pick up on things so quickly." "Pick up on what things?" "Emily, how much do you know about the history of this hospital?" "Just the basics. Built in 1873, one of the oldest hospitals in the state. That's the official history. But there's more to it than that. Room 313 has a story. Patients assigned there, they report things, they see things, they hear things." "What kind of things?" "Voices calling their names, shadows moving when no one else is inside, the feeling that someone is standing right beside their bed, watching. 3 weeks ago, we had a patient in that room, a 45-year-old woman recovering from a routine surgery. On her second night, she began screaming at 3:17 a.m., claiming that a woman in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform was trying to inject her with something. Hallucinations aren't uncommon in ICU patients. That's what we thought. But when we reviewed the security footage, we saw her door opening and closing on its own at exactly 3:17. No one entered, no one left, but the door clearly moved, and the temperature sensors registered a 15-degree drop in just 2 minutes. Before I could respond, Dr. Richard's voice came through the intercom. "Emily, could you come to the nurses' station, please?" I found Dr. Richard looking concerned. "We're receiving a patient in about 30 minutes, a 52-year-old man, post-op gallbladder surgery complications. He's stable, but he'll need close monitoring." "Which room?" I asked, though I already had a bad feeling. "Room 313. We're at full capacity everywhere else." I spent the next 20 minutes preparing room 313. It was identical to the others, but as I worked, I became acutely aware of the atmosphere. The air felt heavier somehow, and the temperature was distinctly colder. I was checking the heart monitor when I heard it for the first time, a faint, rhythmic knocking from inside the walls. I froze, listening carefully, but the sound stopped the moment I focused on it. The patient, Mr. Walter Green, arrived at 12:45 a.m. He was conscious and alert, though clearly uncomfortable from his recent surgery. It was only after we completed his admission that I noticed the change in his behavior. He kept staring at the corner near the window. "Are you all right, Mr. Green?" "There's someone standing there," he said, pointing to the corner. "An older woman in a white dress. She's been watching us since you brought me in. Mr. Green, you've just had surgery and you're on pain medication. It's not unusual to see things that aren't really there. I know what medication can do, nurse. I'm a pharmacist. I understand how drugs affect perception. But I'm telling you, there's a woman standing right there, and she looks very sad." At 1:15, I stepped out to finish my rounds. When I returned 30 minutes later, I found him sitting up in bed, visibly agitated. "She's trying to tell me something." The woman in the corner. "She keeps pointing at the wall behind my bed and saying something I can't understand. Look at the temperature." I checked the digital display and felt my breath catch. The room temperature had dropped from 72 to 61 degrees. The thermostat still showed 72, and the heating system was functioning normally. It's not the heating system. It's her. Every time she moves closer to the bed, the temperature falls. Then I heard it again, the soft, deliberate knocking from inside the walls. This time, Mr. Green heard it too. "It's been happening for the last 10 minutes. Sounds like someone knocking, trying to get out." Dr. Richard arrived within minutes. The temperature had returned to normal, the knocking had stopped, and Mr. Green seemed calmer, though he kept glancing toward the corner. As we prepared to transfer him, Mr. Green grabbed my arm. "Nurse, before we leave, look at the wall behind the bed. Really look at it." I stepped closer to the wall. At first glance, it looked normal, but as I examined it more carefully, I noticed something strange. The paint over a section about 3 feet wide was slightly different in color and texture, as if it had been patched and repainted. "Dr. Richard, can you take a look at this?" He joined me, running his hand across the surface. "This section has definitely been repaired. Probably years ago, judging by the way the paint has aged." We completed Mr. Green's transfer to room 403, where he immediately seemed more at ease. By 3 a.m., I returned to the nurse's station. At 3:17, Dr. Richard appeared, carrying a thick folder. "Emily, I think it's time you knew the full story of room 313. He opened the folder, revealing years of documentation, incident reports, patient statements, temperature logs, and photographs. I've been keeping records of unusual events in that room for over 15 years. What happened tonight is not an isolated incident. I flipped through the documents, seeing the same pattern repeated. Patients reporting visual and auditory hallucinations, unexplained temperature drops, equipment failures, and one consistent description, a woman in white. Dr. Richard, have you ever investigated the history of that specific room? I tried, but the hospital's early records are incomplete. What I do know is that during the influenza pandemic of 1918, the The fourth floor was converted into an isolation ward for the sickest patients. He pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping dated October 1918. The headline read, "Local nurse dies in service of influenza victims." Her name was Clara Whitmore. She was 38, had worked here for 6 years. She contracted influenza while caring for patients and died after 3 days. I studied the accompanying photograph, a young woman in the white uniform of that era, with dark hair and serious, compassionate eyes. The article mentioned she died in room 313, but there's more. He produced another document, handwritten, much older. This is from the personal journal of Dr. Edmund Hartley, who was chief of medicine during the pandemic. The entry was dated October 15th, 1918. Clara Whitmore passed this morning after a brave fight with influenza. In her final hours, delirious with fever, she kept saying she had to tell someone something important, that something was hidden and must be found. She died clutching a scrap of paper, too faded to read. I decided to seal her personal belongings inside the wall of her room as a memorial to her service. I turned to Dr. Richard. The patched section of the wall in room 313 contains Clara Whitmore's belongings, sealed there for more than a century. And, judging by the pattern of events in that room, I believe she's been trying to communicate ever since. What do you think she's trying to say? Dr. Richard closed the folder. I don't know. But I think it's time we found out. The following night, I arrived early to find Dr. Richard waiting with David Rodriguez and Olivia Williams. I asked them to join us. If we're going to do this, we should do it properly. Dr. Richard had spent the day researching Clara Whitmore's history and had recovered additional documents from the hospital archives. Among them was a letter from Clara's sister, written 6 months after Clara's death, asking about Clara's personal belongings, specifically a diary Clara had been keeping during the pandemic. The letter mentioned that Clara had been deeply disturbed by something she had discovered in the weeks before her death, and intended to report her concerns to the appropriate authorities. Even more disturbing was a letter from Dr. Hartley to the hospital board, recommending that room 313 be permanently sealed because Clara's personal belongings contained observations and allegations that could harm the hospital's reputation. At 11:30 p.m., we went to room 313. Dr. Richard had brought tools from the maintenance department. As Dr. Richard began removing the outer layer of drywall, the temperature immediately started to drop. More significantly, the heart monitor, despite no patient being connected, began to show a heartbeat. It's showing a normal sinus rhythm. That's impossible. As Dr. Richard continued to work, the heart monitor began showing irregularities, as if we were observing someone's heart responding to stress or excitement. Dr. Richard broke the final layer of plaster, revealing a small cavity containing a wooden box wrapped in oiled cloth. As soon as it was removed, the heart monitor returned to flatline and the temperature began to rise. Inside the box, we found a leather-bound diary, a silver locket, a fountain pen, and a folded letter. Dr. Richard opened the diary and began reading Clara's entries from September 1918. What we discovered was horrifying. Clara had documented a systematic pattern of experimental treatments being administered to flu patients without their knowledge or consent. Dr. Morrison, working with Dr. Hartley's approval, had used the pandemic as an opportunity to test unproven remedies on vulnerable patients. Clara's final entry, dated October 13th, 1918, was the most damning. I can no longer remain silent about what I have witnessed. Dr. Morrison's experimental treatments killed at least 30 patients I documented. These were people who could have survived with proper care, but instead were used as test subjects for treatments Dr. Morrison knew were dangerous. I have compiled detailed records of each case. I intend to present this evidence to the hospital board and the state medical board. I have hidden copies of my documentation in case something happens to me. The folded letter was addressed to the state medical board, dated October 14th, 1918, the day before Clara's death. She was murdered. They deliberately gave her the flu to silence her. She died trying to protect patients, and Dr. Hartley made sure her evidence was buried with her. Dr. Richard carefully placed all the items back in the box. We will do what Clara could not. We will tell her story. We will make sure the truth is known. Over the next few hours, we documented everything we had found. Dr. Richard contacted the current head of the hospital staff, explaining our discovery and requesting a meeting with the board of directors. As dawn approached, we returned Clara's belongings to room 313, but this time placed them in a position of honor on the windowsill, where they could be seen and remembered. The change in the room was immediate and profound. The oppressive atmosphere that had characterized room 313 for decades disappeared, replaced by a sense of peace and tranquility. 3 weeks later, Columbia General Hospital held a ceremony to honor Clara Whitmore's memory and acknowledge the injustices committed during the 1918 pandemic. A plaque was installed in room 313, telling her story and recognizing her courage. The room was renamed the Clara Whitmore Memorial Room. The hospital also established the Clara Whitmore Foundation for Medical Ethics, and her diary was donated to the medical school library as a teaching tool. The darkest thing I witnessed that night was not a supernatural manifestation. It was realizing that people in positions of trust had deliberately harmed vulnerable patients and covered up their crimes. But I also witnessed something beautiful: the power of truth to heal old wounds, and the enduring strength of the human spirit to seek justice even beyond death. Clara Whitmore waited more than a century to tell her story, to ensure that the truth was finally revealed. Her story reminds us that in healthcare, the truth may be buried for a time, but it will always find a way to surface. And when it does, it has the power to heal not only the living, but also the dead who have been patiently waiting for justice. If this story impacted you as much as it impacted me, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments. Do you believe the dead can really try to communicate with us when an injustice needs to be corrected? And remember, some truths may be buried for a century, but they always find a way back to the surface.